He's another unsung heroes, which is Scottish scenic artists, along with women and people of colour. And what we find is how pervasive and still within the profession they are. But what I'd like to do is almost go back a century before the 19th century to kind of explain where that tradition for Scottish artists come from, which is still alive. I haven't pressed all the wrong buttons. So we're going to have to go back to the government and put this in context of what kind of framework these artists were working or not working at this point. And this is the censorship of the stage and why it took so long for any visual depiction of the country, of images at all to come to the light. Certainly in Scotland that was even more so because of the church. But the Act of Parliament, which was actually built on another Act of Parliament in 1737, I love the wording, that it was for more effectual punishing, because it didn't have enough, you just had to even do more punishing of rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars and vagrants, and sending them whither whence they ought to be sent. That sounds a bit reminiscent of a Tory government, but there we are. As it relates to the common players of interludes, so that's of actors. So there was a complete censorship of the stage at that stage, and in Scotland it was even more so because of the clergy and under the Court of Session and the establishment in Scotland made sure that that act was put into practice. So it really held back the profession, and I say it took probably 100 years for there to be equivalent practice in Scotland that there was in the rest of England at that time. But as I said, we're still back a century before the 19th century, but when it really started to take hold with this production by John Coombe, a tragedy called Douglas. Now at this period you weren't allowed to have spoken plays, so if you notice very craftily it's written on the playbill at the top here, you'll see it's described as a concert of music, although in fact it was theatre. And again, it's the Canongate Music Hall instead of the theatre. And some great protagonists here that some of you will be aware of, like Mr. Diggs and Mrs. Ward, who was instrumental in changing the scene in Scotland at that period. But what was important about this play is it also gave the vernacular Scots a platform for the first time, because up until then it had been Shakespeare and some other writers who had been performed as song almost, not quite song, but there'd be song interludes in between the scenes to make so they kept below the radar of the establishment. And it's really with that the painted scenery also started to be seen on the stage. And in this particular case, it was a certain Mr. Delacour. And at that point, we realised that the audience wanted to see the scenes, and so they would be advertised. This is the point at which scenic artists start to be seen in the playbills, certainly in Scotland, sometimes in England a little before then. And in the evening Edinburgh Corinth, 1757, in Tyne you would see by Delacour. And this is when we start to see the names appear in the illustrated magazines and on the playbills. And certainly no women at this point. Just to go back, he's not Scottish, he's not even British. He is William Delacour, who came and first films painted from France, who came to London, was at the King's Theatre. And then he moved to Scotland, to Edinburgh in 1757, and he was the man responsible for painting the scene for Douglas at the Canongate Concert Hall. But he also painted theatrical scenery in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Crucially, he was also the first master of the Trustees' Academy in Edinburgh. This is the period when things like the Royal Academy and the Trustees' Academy, so what was considered fine art academies, had started to be established in the 1800s, or 1700s, 18th century. And up until this point, paintings weren't seen by the general public. Even in the academies, paintings weren't seen. And up until this point, painting wasn't really seen that much in the theatre. So this explosion of visual art within these two worlds came together and started at this earlier period. And one key family in Scotland who started off a century before are the Norrie family. The oldest, James Norrie, was a decorative painter for scenic decorative art within houses. So we're talking about things like Pennywick, which is the biggest estate in Scotland. So these would have been, again, not in the public domain, but that's where the profession started. This is a mixture often of glue temper or distemper, but also oil on walls sometimes, depending on the kind of nature of the work that was asked of them. Importantly, he started a dynasty who became not just painters of decorative art, but of scenic art, landscape painting, and in the case of Naismith, we'll talk about much more. The Norries specialised in decorative art, but really they lay the foundation for a whole tradition in Scotland. Just to give you a nice sense of what they were painting at the time, as we've seen, there are so few actual cloths, so few images of cloths of the period. So one visual way of imagining is looking at the art of the artists, the Scenic artists, or the decorative artists, who then actually displayed their works at the academies. Yes, these paintings were in 90% of them in oil paint, but they give a sense of how the artists would have painted when they were painting as a decorative scenic artist as well, I believe. It gives some visual picture of what they were about. And this is from James Norrie Senior, and it's a scene of Edinburgh from the west. And you can imagine this being painted on a large wall, equivalent in the houses in Scotland, and also in the houses in Northumberland as well. This tradition started there. Interestingly enough, what Norrie did was send his two sons down to London to a well-known scenic artist at the time, James Lambert, who Rosenfeld has written about extensively. And he was popular for his ability to paint for the stage realistic scenes of Surrey, in this case of Box Hill and Dover Castle in the bottom. So Norrie was aware of this tradition going on down in London, so he sent his two sons down there to study down there initially. They were valued for their realism, but it was the period in which the realism, the stock scenery was there, but they also wanted scenes that related to the plays that were being played and were realistic to plays. But it took probably another 100 years for them to be genuinely realistic, in that sense where the audience could see the hills of Scotland, and it wasn't a generic hill, a generic castle. Again, we don't have any of Lambert's scene paintings. We have some of his sketches within the V&A archive, but these are his oil paintings, again giving a sense of what his painting would have looked like for the stage. In Scotland, that tradition goes back to probably the earliest recognised scenic artist, who was also a landscape painter, to Jacob Moore, who I'll talk about in a minute. But there's a large, long tradition. John Knox, I'll talk briefly about, John Jock Wilson, David Roberts, J.F. Williams, Alexander Naismith, and of course the Green family. And that tradition has carried on in the 20th and 21st century with Alec Johnson, Keith Crombie, Selwyn Bryan, John McFarlane, to name but a very few of the many who are out there from that tradition. I'm going to focus on one of those important artists, Jacob Moore, because we do have some of images from his sketches that are in the National Galleries of Scotland archives. So he was important, partly because he was renowned in his day, in his own lifetime. In the adverts, you see the scenes and dresses to be entirely new and suitable to the characters of opera. The scenes invented, and importantly, he was the designer as well as the painter, invented and painted by Mr. Moore. We don't have those scenes, but what we do have is a sense of what he sketched for those, and this is one of the sketches from the stage set of that, which is held in the archives. But we do have one of his most famous paintings of the Falls of Clyde, which is actually, knowing this place very well, it's actually really realistic. I think the dresses changed, but the sense of place is very much there. There's a heightened sense of perspective, but you can sense what, again, this painting is an oil painting, but it's on exhibition at the National Gallery of Scotland. I think it's actually on exhibition at the moment. So our legacy, his legacy to us, are these images now in oil paint. And one thing that's come across is this thing about technique and materials. These artists could work in oil, watercolour, tempera paint, and also decorative techniques, both on wall, on canvas, and in some cases on other media as well. And that's how much sort of amazing artists they actually were, to be able to go between these different genres and different scales as well. We mentioned the travelling, I think David mentioned travelling theatre companies. I'm showing this one just as a kind of example of this change that occurred, and I think kind of the politics of what was going on is really important to how the profession changed. So the Theatre Act of 1788 then allowed movement of theatres in the provinces. So there was a movement to have travelling licensed trade companies, and this was brought about by the Act, but also the roads that had joined Scotland and the rest of the north to the south. So there's the general roads that were kept to keep the Jacobites in order, then became Telford's roads. And those roads allowed not just the movement of scenery by cart and later by train, but initially also artists travelling, taking images, sketching, writing travellers, talking about the countryside, talking about the landscape, and also scenic artists going on their own sketching tours to take sketches that they then use as part of the design in the theatre. And they pride themselves, in the case of John Knox, on scenes taken from life or painted from life that they then put into play. And that again is also seen out on the playbills and in the advertising for the play themselves. I'm just going to talk about John Knox. Actually, we don't have evidence of John Knox painted for the stage, but what he did do is spectacular style as a panorama painter. This is actually the oil painting that exists. There's two of them. One is the National Gallery of Scotland, and the other is in the Kelvin Grove Gallery in Glasgow. Two sets of oil paintings, so much smaller scale. These are 2 metres roughly by 1 metre each, and they form a continuous painting. The original painting, which was painted on as far as we can tell, on linen, on tempera, was 300-foot square panorama in a wooden rotunda on Princes Street, which brought the wonders of Scotland and Ben Lomond to the people of Glasgow and London. They travelled to London, Dublin, and major cities. And that tradition again of decorative art, panorama painting, with the same technique that's used in the theatre of perspective, of spectacular, of sublime. Probably Knox, in terms of panoramas, was probably the greatest exponent. And again, our only experience of these amazing objects are through these few oil paintings and the few examples that live in the States and the Hague. I think it's 3 in the States of panoramas and 1 at the Hague. But this key idea of perspective and embracing the audience by this, but you're in the scene, was definitely part of that earlier stage. A key player in all this was Alexander Naismith. He was, again, apprenticed under Norrie and studied under Runciman, who was an important artist who became the last also the trustee. So this fluidity between fine art, for want of a better word, and scenic art was very much there. There wasn't that definition that we seem to have got into on the whole much later in the next couple of centuries. And he worked as a landscape painter. He worked as a landscaper for Pennywick House. He also did the second panorama of Albion Mills, which was displayed, and he had a drawing school in Edinburgh. And in fact, his daughter definitely trained as an actress, and there's a very slight chance she also painted, but I haven't yet to prove that yet. So he was really important, and I think why he became almost the hero is that he simulated his Scottish roots in his paintings, and he took ownership of that landscape and was able to add that to his art. And of course, he's well known for working both sides in Scotland and in the south as well. And again, we don't have the evidence of his scene painting, but what we do have are quite a large collection, certainly in Scotland, of his oil paintings. He exhibited regularly at the academies up in Scotland and some down in the south. And this particular painting on the left I want to pay attention to because it refers to a scenic painting later on. So this is a painting from Dumbarton Castle and Town with Ben Lomond in the background. What you see at the rock at the front is actually Dumbarton Rock, and you can see Ben Lomond in the distance with the Clyde. This is owned by our gallery at the Hunterian. And another example of a Naismith of Edinburgh from the west, one of the classic scenes of Edinburgh painted by Naismith. So these are part of his genre as a landscape painter. As a scene artist, we do not have any of the actual cloths. What we do have are some preparatory sketches. One is from what's thought to be a side wing for the Theatre Royal Glasgow, and one is a set design for the interior of what's called Dean's Cottage, which was a collection of cottages at the bottom of Salisbury Crags by Edinburgh Castle. So you can get a sense, he was also an architect by training, so you can see that, the architectural element of his drawing there, and the detail in which he paints, he draws the leaves there. And this lovely comment by William Leach, who was quite an important painter and also teacher to Victoria, Queen Victoria. You could pull aside the branch of the tree and find another beneath it. That sense of three-dimensionality that he brought to his work. Well, I found this particular quote about Naismith in one of the newspapers, and it brought it back to this image that we have, or the actual painting we have in the galleries by him. Stocktree leaf, so this is for Stocktree in 1805, including the scene at the request of a certain Sterling of Glasgow. A magnificent view of the Clyde looking towards Dumbarton Rock. It was much admired and was held with great esteem. that image there is going to likely is earlier than the final cloth, but at least you have a sense, back to how maybe when you were sitting in the Glasgow Theatre, what you might have seen behind you from the Naismith. Again, you would have been painting in tempera rather than oil, but that sense of what he was able to bring to the scene, I think is a fantastic thing that we can have for these artists who are also great landscape painters. There are some, for Naismith, there's probably a better collection of sketches than for many of the early scene painters, just because we're coming closer into the 19th century and more survived than the early artists that I've been mentioning. Now, the Greaves, although they're most known for their work in London, actually originally came from Perth, so we were going to claim them for Scotland. John Henderson Grieve was seen to be the first of the generation of the Grieve family and worked at Covent Garden, as we know, and his sons followed in that profession. Most of that archive seems to derive at the V&A, for those who are interested in looking at those original sketches. But again, we don't have any, as far as I know, any more than the descriptions that are in illustrated newspapers to those original designs and the few examples of sketches that there are. So both Thomas and William followed on from there, and it's described in one newspaper review at the time that William Grieve was the best painter and landscapers in the country as a scenic artist. But what we do have, to be asked to imagine how the works of this great family work, is a fantastic collection of the Grieve family collection at Scenic House Library in London, which was found, I think someone told me it was found in the junk shop, quite a classic case of behind, no one really cared about it. So now I think it's all been digitised. When I went to hadn't been, I'm pretty sure you can see all this now digitised. And we think we know an attribution to William Grieve rather than to Thomas. One is for the scene from Macbeth, and the other is this, well, there's a large collection, but one of the other ones that I particularly like is this lovely little booklet. And if you look at the bottom, you can see it's got Tyne, because there's actually 5 scenes that he's bound together, so you can see the cut cloth, the back cloth, and all the different levels of the scene put together for the production. So this is a fantastic resource to get a sense of what the Grieve's work would have looked like as well. Now, the connection Grieve does go back to Scotland and also to Naismith. Barbara Bell's written extensively about this connection of Water Scotland, the vernacular in Scotland. And it can't be underestimated how important Scott's contribution was to the theatre, because he brought a language and the heroic characters that are in The Lady in the Lake, The Heart of Midlothian, and Rob Roy, which is still going strong. But with that, also, it gave the artist a great, fantastic palette with which to paint with, which was genuine and related to what they were doing. And the new scenery was constantly then being painted for the Trossachs, so that's where Ben Lomond is, and Lochatree, which is at the bottom of Ben Lomond. But with a narrative now of the plays of Walter Scott. And so for the Walter Scott first production, they asked Alexander Naismith to be the designer, but also William Grieve. There was 2 productions of this, one in London, one in Edinburgh. William Grieve actually painted the set in London, and there's a separate set paint in London, but the designs came from Naismith. This is held at National Gallery of Scotland. I said digitised as well, it's online, of those initial set designs for The Heart of Midlothian. And what we have here is from the Covent Garden production of 1819, one of the set designs, watercolour designs from the Grieve collection in London, that followed on from Naismith's image there. Again, we don't have any other points of reference apart from these watercolour sketches for this particular production. But I think what I like about this is it shows 2 great artists drawing upon each other and drawing upon their history of their own place and putting it all together in these 2 productions. So this scene here would have been the full squared up version, being pulled up for the full square. The full squared up version of the full cloth on the left. So that's one complete scene there that you can see. There are others part of that. It's not complete, but the Heart of Rome is quite good. And again, there's a quote from one of the newspapers of the time saying, "Beautiful beyond description, we have seen nothing so rich, graphic and masterly as the first scene of Salisbury Crags after seat in Dean's Cottage." So this is what we can imagine when we look at that. I've talked about the fact that as artists in their own right, and I mean later on, certainly Tyne complains that he's not considered as good as the Scenic painters. You know, he's very passionate about this. But at the earlier period, the Kent they just got on with it. They exhibited at the Royal Academy in London. So there are records, and I haven't been able to find the paintings he's related to. As Dave said something earlier about, you can see when you look at auction sites, some of these works seem to come up and down, but they are not in public collections on the whole, for people like the Greaves, and Naismith there is, but not for the Greaves so much. But they definitely exhibited at the Royal Academy in London, and the dates, we have the dates, if you look at the catalogues for the Royal Academy, you can see that William Greave exhibited at least 4 times, and Thomas Greave at least another 4 times. What we don't have is knowing where the provenance and where those paintings are. Now, anyone who does know where they are, please let me know. But I assume that I'm private collections or aren't appreciated for what they are. One example that came up recently, which is part of the James Gordon collection, that hopefully will eventually come to Glasgow University, where he has over 5,000 set designs. It was this one that I saw only last year, which is from Thomas Greave. Again, it's a sense of what Thomas Greave's work would have been like. This is a set design for what's translated to Castles in the Air by Thomas Greave. So we've gone all the way to Scotland and back again, and as we know that the Greaves are most famous in London, working at Macklin Street here, and this is this sale bill effectively for the sale of Macklin Street, where we see the great protagonists of both Greaves and Son and Telvin, scenic artists, when the property of Macklin Street was set up for sale originally. I go wistfully past every often, always take a picture of it just to make sure that it's still got pictures of it taken. It's now private flats in London. So that kind of era of the Scottish artists who came to London, but they went back and forth. That was what I think became very clear when I was doing this research, and this research is continuing, is that amount of fluidity between London theatres, Scottish theatres, also Dublin, which I haven't mentioned very much because it's kind of a whole other thing. Harker went to Dublin, for instance, as well. But only between the big cities, also the port cities as well, and Newcastle, Liverpool, and other places as well. That fluidity, they weren't always in one place. What I don't know, which we've talked about paint frames in London, and we've talked about Newcastle, we have of course the Citizens, which I haven't got time to talk about, but to me what I haven't found are the equivalent paint shops in Scotland. So I'm still unclear about that world of paint shops, how that worked in the north compared to in the south. Now if I've got time, I don't know how much. Right, okay, I'm going to, if you indulge me, I'm just going to show you just 2 things related to this that kind of taking us to the 20th century. My research is probably much too wide-ranging. I'll never finish before I die, but you know, someone else can take it on. Really looks at it from the 17th century to the 21st. That's a long time, which includes oral histories as well. But I wanted to kind of focus still on the Scottish tradition here. And actually I found this, and it got mentioned earlier this morning, John Connor. Now I think it's the same John Connor. It's John O'Connor in some newspapers, sometimes it's John O'Connor in other. And this is this lovely tradition between artists and scenic artists. And this is from the memoirs of Henry Irving's grandson. When my grandfather, Henry Irving, was serving his apprenticeship as a walking gentleman at the Royal Theatre, Edinburgh, he is befriended by a popular actor, William Harker. Harker had married a sister of John O'Connor, the scenic artist of renown at the time. Their son, Joseph, inherited his uncle's talent. So we've got this lovely fluidity between the south and the north, and the families. It's not quite incestuous, but it's keeping it in the family at least, which I think is quite traditional with the scenic art anyway. And I'll show you this because on our paint frame at Citizens in Glasgow, this is being restored. We have the original, and David is very much involved in this in terms of the architectural elements of this. The paint frame, and I've taken paint samples right back to the wall. And there is very slight chance that the original paint we see at the very bottom here belongs to a certain John Connor. And the first production was the pantomime Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, which presented the best act drop that had ever been seen in Glasgow at that point. So I just wanted kind of that kind of history that is still there. And I plead to any of you who work in scenic art shops, paint shops and theatres, anyone who has good chunks of paint for me to look at, I'm more than willing to do that because we can build up this history of the artists through their images, through their paintings, but also through the splatter that they left behind, and to try and build up the story of the tradition. And what's interesting here is when you do the analysis, you have the glue tempera, and you get to the top, you get the acrylic paints at the top. But there's a lot more in here. There's a whole thing on this. And I'd just like to end with one short oral history, which brings another two great gentlemen together, which is this Calvin Wright guy, who was just got mentioned by Rick, and a certain Mr. John Campbell and Flint. And this is, when I did his oral history, it was a little story he told me about going between Glasgow and London. I don't know, yeah, should come up here.
So when it came to the cloths,
Right.
they were stored in London.
Where have they been done?
Now, all over the place, but principally at John Campbell and at Harker's. They're the two
Okay.
sort of proper ones. So I would go down there ostensibly to work on the cloths. I say ostensibly because with John, you've met John and how erratic he could be in the old days. We would be doing cloths for, all over the place. So I'd be part of his team of maybe about 4 of us. We'd all be working under him, and on various productions that I would be scheduled to come back up to the opera to give the lowdown on how the cloths were going, and I would have to lie and say they look great. We hadn't even started them. So, eventually all